When Margaret Hartwell stood in my driveway waving that official HOA violation notice, demanding I remove my century-old oak trees or face weekly fines of $500, I knew she had no idea what she'd just unleashed. Those majestic giants weren't just trees, they were living monuments to a forgotten era. And by the time I was done fighting back, the entire neighborhood power structure would be turned upside down. Margaret thought she could bulldoze her way through history, but she was about to learn that some battles are worth fighting, and sometimes the underdog has allies she never saw coming. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any more epic Karen stories, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning everything changed started like any other Tuesday in Willowbrook Estates. I was sipping my coffee on the back porch, watching the sunrise filter through the canopy of my two massive oak trees, when I heard the sharp click of designer heels on my driveway. Margaret Hartwell, HOA president and self-appointed neighborhood dictator, was marching toward my front door with the determination of a woman on a mission. I'd moved to this upscale lakeside community 3 years ago, drawn by the promise of peaceful mornings and the historic charm of older homes nestled among mature trees. What I hadn't bargained for was living under the iron fist of someone who treated homeowners association rules like constitutional law. I opened the door before she could ring the bell, partly out of courtesy and partly because I'd learned that keeping Margaret waiting only made her more insufferable. She stood there in her perfectly pressed blazer, clutching a manila folder against her chest like a shield, her silver hair styled in that aggressive bob that seemed to defy both gravity and good sense. Her lips were pressed into a thin line that I'd come to recognize as her default expression whenever she was about to deliver bad news disguised as community improvement. "Good morning, Margaret," I said, keeping my voice neutral despite the sinking feeling in my stomach. "What brings you by so early?" "David, we need to talk about your trees," she said, not bothering with pleasantries. She opened the folder and pulled out a official-looking document with the HOA letterhead. "I've received multiple complaints from residents about the obstruction of lake views caused by your oak trees. According to Section 12 of our community guidelines, any landscaping that significantly impairs the aesthetic value or property values of neighboring homes must be addressed." I felt my jaw tighten as I took the document from her hands. The violation notice was printed on thick, expensive paper, complete with legal language that made it sound like my trees were somehow committing a crime against the community. "Margaret, these trees were here when I bought the house. They were here when this neighborhood was developed. Hell, they were probably here when your grandparents were kids." "That's irrelevant," she said, her voice taking on that condescending tone that made my teeth ache. "What matters is that they're blocking premium lake views from 3 different properties. The Hendersons paid $1.8 million for their home specifically because of the water view, and now they're telling me they can barely see the lake through your tree branches. The Clarksons and the Brewsters have filed similar complaints." I studied the document more carefully, noting the highlighted sections about compliance timelines and penalty structures. "So you're saying I need to cut down trees that are probably older than this entire development because some neighbors want a better view?" "I'm saying you need to comply with community standards," Margaret replied, her tone growing sharper. "You have 30 days to remove or significantly trim the trees to restore the lake views. If you don't, you'll face weekly fines of $500 until the issue is resolved. This isn't personal, David. It's about maintaining property values and community harmony." The irony wasn't lost on me. Community harmony apparently meant destroying pieces of natural history so that people could have unobstructed views of the lake from their million-dollar homes. I looked past Margaret, toward my backyard, where the 2 oak trees stood like ancient sentinels, their massive trunks easily 4 feet in diameter and their canopies spreading wide enough to shade half my property. These weren't just trees. They were living monuments to a time when this area was still wild, before developers came in and carved up the landscape into neat suburban lots. "Margaret, have you ever actually looked at these trees?" I asked, stepping aside and gesturing toward the backyard. "I mean, really looked at them? Do you have any idea how old they are or what they represent?" She glanced toward the trees with the same expression she might use to examine a piece of lint on her jacket. They're trees, David. Nice trees, I'm sure, but trees, nonetheless. They can be replaced with something more appropriate for the neighborhood aesthetic. Something that won't block views or drop leaves all over everyone's property. That comment crystallized everything I'd been feeling about Margaret and her approach to running the HOA. She saw the world in terms of property values and aesthetic compliance, with no regard for history, ecology, or the intrinsic value of things that couldn't be quantified in dollars. In her mind, everything could be replaced, upgraded, or improved according to whatever standards she deemed appropriate. The fact that these trees had been growing here for over a century, that they'd survived storms and droughts and the gradual encroachment of suburban development, meant nothing to her. "I'll need to think about this," I said, folding the violation notice and sliding it into my back pocket. 30 days, right? 29 days now, Margaret corrected, checking her watch with theatrical precision. The clock started ticking yesterday when the notice was officially filed. I'd recommend getting quotes from tree removal services sooner rather than later. The good ones tend to book up quickly, especially for jobs this size. After she left, I stood in my backyard, staring up at the oak trees, trying to process what had just happened. The morning sun was streaming through their leaves, casting intricate patterns of light and shadow across the grass. I'd spent countless hours under these trees over the past 3 years, reading, thinking, and simply enjoying the sense of peace they provided. They'd been here through the Great Depression, World War II, the cultural upheavals of the 1960s, and all the changes that had transformed this region from rural farmland to suburban paradise. Now they were being treated like inconvenient obstacles to be removed in the name of progress. I pulled out my phone and called my neighbor Jake Morrison, one of the few people in Willowbrook Estates who seemed to share my appreciation for the area's natural heritage. Jake was a retired history professor who'd moved here specifically because he wanted to live somewhere that still retained some connection to the past. His house was 3 doors down from mine, and we'd boggled over our shared frustration with the HOA's increasingly aggressive approach to neighborhood management. "Jake, you're not going to believe what just happened," I said when he answered. "Margaret wants me to cut down my oak trees." "The big ones in your backyard?" Jake's voice carried a mixture of disbelief and outrage. "Those trees are incredible. They've got to be some of the oldest specimens in the county." "That's what I'm thinking," I said, pacing back and forth across my deck, "but Margaret says they're blocking lake views and affecting property values. She's giving me 30 days to remove them or face weekly fines." "This is insane," Jake said. "Those trees are probably older than the town itself. Has anyone ever done a proper assessment of their age or ecological significance?" That question sparked something in my mind. I'd been thinking about this problem in terms of homeowner rights and HOA overreach. But Jake had just opened up a completely different angle. What if these trees weren't just old, but historically or ecologically significant? What if there were protections available that could supersede the HOA's authority? "Jake, you used to work with the university, right? Do you know anyone in the forestry department who might be able to help?" "Actually, yes," Jake said, his voice taking on an excited tone. "My old colleague Sarah Chen is now the head of the forestry program at State University. She specializes in old-growth forest preservation and heritage tree documentation. If anyone could assess the significance of your oaks, it would be her." I felt a surge of hope for the first time since Margaret had showed up at my door. "Do you think she'd be willing to take a look?" "Are you kidding? Sarah lives for this stuff. She's been working on a project to identify and protect remaining old-growth specimens throughout the region. Your trees could be exactly what she's looking for." That afternoon, I found myself driving to the university campus for the first time in years. The forestry building was a modern structure tucked away in a corner of the campus, surrounded by experimental gardens and greenhouse facilities. Sarah Chen turned out to be an energetic woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that lit up when she talked about trees. Her office was cluttered with core samples, scientific journals, and photographs of magnificent trees from around the world. "Jake told me about your situation," she said, settling into her chair behind a desk covered with research papers. HOA trying to force you to remove old oaks? 2 massive specimens, I said, pulling out my phone to show her the photos I'd taken that morning. They're in my backyard, probably 4 feet in diameter, with canopies that spread over most of my property. Sarah studied the photos with growing excitement, occasionally making small sounds of appreciation. These are beautiful trees. From what I can see here, they look like they could be white oaks, possibly in the 100 to 150-year range. The branch structure and bark patterns are consistent with old growth characteristics. Is there any way to determine their exact age and significance? Absolutely, Sarah said, leaning forward with enthusiasm. We can do core sampling to get precise age data, and I can assess their ecological value and historical importance. But let me ask you something, David. Are you prepared to fight for these trees? The question caught me off guard. What do you mean? If these trees turn out to be as significant as I think they might be, there are legal protections we can pursue. Heritage tree designations, historical landmark status, ecological preserve classifications. But that means going head-to-head with your HOA and potentially drawing a lot of attention to your situation. Are you ready for that kind of battle? I thought about Margaret's dismissive attitude toward the trees, her complete disregard for their history and value. I thought about the other neighbors who saw them as nothing more than obstacles to their lake views. I thought about the principle of protecting something irreplaceable from being destroyed for the sake of convenience and property values. Yes, I said without hesitation. I'm ready. Sarah smiled and reached for her calendar. Then let's schedule a site visit. I'll bring my equipment and a graduate student to help with the assessment. We'll get you the documentation you need to make your case. 3 days later, Sarah arrived at my house with a small crew of graduate students and enough scientific equipment to stock a small laboratory. I watched from my deck as they carefully examined the trees, taking core samples, measuring trunk circumference, and documenting everything with professional photography. The process took most of the morning, and I found myself getting more excited as I saw the team's growing enthusiasm for what they were discovering. David, these trees are remarkable, Sarah said as she packed up her equipment. The core samples confirm they're both over 100 years old, with the larger one possibly dating back to the 1870s, but that's not the most significant finding. What do you mean? These are white oaks, but there are specific subspecies that's becoming increasingly rare in this region. Development pressure and environmental changes have eliminated most of the old growth specimens. And what you have here represents some of the last remaining examples of the original forest ecosystem that once covered this entire area." End quote. I felt a chill run down my spine as the implications of what she was saying began to sink in. So they're not just old trees, they're historically and ecologically significant? Exactly. And that means they qualify for protection under several different statutes: state environmental protection laws, county heritage preservation ordinances, and federal regulations governing the destruction of significant ecological specimens. Your HOA's authority to demand their removal is legally questionable at best." End quote. That evening, I sat on my deck with a glass of wine, staring up at the trees with a completely new understanding of what they represented. They weren't just beautiful features of my landscape, they were living links to a vanished world. They'd been growing here when this land was still wild, when Native American tribes moved through these forests, when the first European settlers began clearing land for farms. They'd survived the transformation of the region from wilderness to agriculture to suburban development, and now they were among the last remaining witnesses to that history. The next morning, I called Margaret to request a meeting. She agreed to come by that afternoon, probably expecting that I'd decided to comply with the HOA's demands. Instead, I had Sarah's preliminary report ready, along with documentation about the tree's potential protected status. Margaret arrived precisely on time, carrying her ever-present folder and wearing the same expression of bureaucratic authority that had become her trademark. I invited her to sit on my deck, where she could see the trees while we talked. "I assume you've had time to consider the situation and get some quotes for tree removal?" she said, settling into her chair with the confidence of someone who is used to getting her way. "Actually, Margaret, I've been researching the legal status of these trees, I said, handing her a copy of Sarah's report. It turns out they're not just old trees, they're potentially protected specimens with significant ecological and historical value. Margaret's expression shifted from confidence to annoyance as she scanned the document. David, this is just academic research. It doesn't change the fact that you're in violation of HOA guidelines and affecting your neighbor's property values. Actually, it changes everything, I said, pulling out my phone to show her the photos Sarah had taken during her assessment. These trees are over a century old and represent one of the last remaining examples of the original forest ecosystem in this region. They qualify for protection under multiple environmental and heritage preservation statutes. This is ridiculous, Margaret said, her voice taking on an edge of desperation. You can't just wave around some university report and expect it to override community standards. The HOA has legal authority to enforce neighborhood guidelines. The HOA's authority is limited by state and federal laws protecting significant natural and historical resources, I replied calmly. If these trees are designated as protected specimens, which they likely will be, then your demand for their removal becomes legally invalid. Margaret stood up abruptly, clutching the report in her hands. This is not over, David. You're trying to use legal technicalities to avoid your responsibility to the community. I'll be consulting with the HOA's lawyers about this situation. That's your prerogative, I said, maintaining my calm demeanor despite the satisfaction I felt at seeing her rattled. But I'd recommend they research environmental protection laws before they advise you to proceed with the fines. After Margaret left, I called Jake to update him on the situation. He was delighted to hear about Sarah's findings and immediately offered to help with the next phase of the campaign. We need to get ahead of this, Jake said. Margaret's going to try to rally the neighborhood against you, and she's got allies on the HOA board. But if we can get the trees officially protected, her hands will be tied. What do you suggest? Let's go public with this. Contact the local media, reach out to environmental groups. Maybe even get the city council involved. The more attention we can draw to the historical and ecological significance of these trees, the harder it will be for the HOA to maintain their position. That suggestion sparked an idea that had been forming in the back of my mind. Jake, what if we hosted a press conference, right here in my backyard, with the trees as the backdrop? We could invite Sarah to present her findings, maybe get some local environmental groups to participate. That's brilliant, Jake said. Nothing puts pressure on bureaucrats like media attention, and having the actual trees there as visual evidence would be incredibly powerful. Over the next week, I threw myself into organizing what I was starting to think of as the Save the Oaks campaign. I reached out to local newspapers, television stations, and environmental organizations, explaining the situation and inviting them to attend a press conference where we would unveil the scientific findings about the tree's significance. The response was better than I'd hoped, with several media outlets expressing interest in the story of homeowner fighting HOA overreach to protect century-old trees. I also contacted the State Historical Society and the County Environmental Protection Office, both of which expressed interest in assessing the trees for potential protected status. The bureaucratic wheels turned slowly, but I could feel momentum building in my favor. The day of the press conference arrived with perfect weather, clear skies, and gentle breezes that made the oak trees look even more majestic than usual. I'd set up folding chairs on my lawn, arranged a small podium where Sarah could present her findings, and prepared information packets for the media attendees. Jake arrived early to help with the setup, and I could see neighbors gathering in their yards and driveways, obviously curious about the unusual activity. Margaret appeared at her front door as the first news van pulled up, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. She stood there for several minutes, apparently debating whether to come over and confront me directly, but eventually retreated inside her house. I suspected she was making phone calls to her allies on the HOA board, trying to figure out how to respond to this unexpected development. The press conference exceeded my expectations. Sarah gave a compelling presentation about the tree's age and ecological significance, complete with photographs and scientific data that made their historical importance undeniable. Representatives from the State Historical Society and County Environmental Office spoke about the process of obtaining protected status for significant natural specimens. a local environmental group leader talked about the broader issue of preserving old-growth trees in the face of development pressure. But the most satisfying moment came when a reporter asked me directly about the HOA's position on the trees. I had prepared for this question, and I delivered my response with the calm confidence of someone who knew he held the winning cards. The HOA seems to view these trees as obstacles to property values and lake views, I said, gesturing toward the magnificent oaks behind me. But these trees are irreplaceable links to our region's natural and cultural heritage. They were here before this neighborhood existed, they'll be here long after we're gone, and they deserve our protection rather than our indifference. The story ran on local television that evening and appeared in the regional newspaper the next morning. The coverage was uniformly positive, portraying the situation as a classic battle between community preservation and bureaucratic overreach. Comments on the news websites were overwhelmingly supportive of protecting the trees, with many people expressing frustration about HOA policies that prioritized aesthetic conformity over historical preservation. Within a week of the press conference, I received official notification that the County Environmental Protection Office had initiated the process of designating my oak trees as protected specimens. The State Historical Society followed with their own assessment, and their preliminary findings supported classification as historically significant natural landmarks. The legal implications were clear, and I suspect Margaret's lawyers had explained them to her in terms that even she couldn't ignore. The HOA's authority to demand removal of the trees was superseded by state and federal protections for significant natural and historical resources. The weekly fines that had been threatened were legally unenforceable, and any attempt to proceed with them would expose the HOA to significant legal liability. But the real victory came in the form of a phone call from the county planning office. The protected status of the trees had created a buffer zone around them, and any activities that might impact their health or stability required approval from the Environmental Protection Office. This included not just major construction projects, but also routine maintenance activities like tree trimming or landscaping changes on adjacent properties. The beautiful irony was that the HOA, which had demanded the right to control my trees, now had to apply for county permits to trim branches that extended over property lines. The neighbors who had complained about blocked lake views were now subject to environmental review if they wanted to modify their landscaping in ways that might affect the protected trees. Margaret's response was predictably bitter. She called an emergency HOA meeting to discuss what she termed the precedent of outside interference in community governance. The meeting was held in the community center, and Jake and I attended as interested homeowners. Margaret's presentation was a masterclass in bureaucratic frustration, as she explained how environmental regulations had undermined the HOA's authority and created complications for future community management. This sets a dangerous precedent, Margaret declared, pacing back and forth in front of the assembled homeowners. If individual residents can override community standards by appealing to outside authorities, then our entire system of neighborhood governance becomes meaningless. Several homeowners asked pointed questions about the specific circumstances that had led to this situation. Had the HOA board consulted with environmental experts before demanding tree removal? Had they considered the potential historical significance of century-old specimens? Had they explored alternatives to complete removal that might have addressed the view concerns without destroying irreplaceable natural heritage? Margaret's answers revealed the fundamental flaw in her approach. She had never considered that the trees might be anything more than landscaping obstacles. She had never researched their potential protected status or consulted with environmental experts. She had simply assumed that HOA authority superseded any other considerations and that homeowners would comply with whatever demands the board made. One homeowner, Mrs. Patterson, who lived on the other side of the neighborhood, raised her hand during the question period. "Margaret, I'm trying to understand how we got to this point. These trees have been there for over a century. They were there when the neighborhood was developed. When the Henderson, Clarkson, and Brewster families bought their homes, how did they suddenly become a problem that required immediate removal?" Margaret's face flushed as she struggled to provide an answer that didn't make her look completely unreasonable. The issue was brought to my attention by concerned residents who felt that their property values were being affected by obstructed views. As HOA president, I have a responsibility to address legitimate community concerns. But did you investigate alternatives? Mrs. Patterson pressed. Selective pruning, partial trimming, maybe working with Mr. Thompson to find a compromise that protected the trees while addressing view concerns? The trees were too large for partial solutions, Margaret replied, but her voice lacked conviction. Complete removal was the only practical option. Jake stood up from his seat near the back of the room. Margaret, with respect, that's simply not true. Professional arborists can perform selective pruning that maintains tree health while addressing specific concerns. The issue here wasn't that alternatives didn't exist. It's that you never explored them. The meeting continued for another hour, but it was clear that Margaret had lost the support of many homeowners who had initially been sympathetic to the view obstruction complaints. The revelation that the trees were historically and ecologically significant had changed the entire dynamic of the situation, and Margaret's inflexible approach now looked like bureaucratic overreach rather than responsible community management. The official designation of the oak trees as protected historical landmarks came through 6 weeks later. The ceremony was held in my backyard, with representatives from the State Historical Society, County Environmental Office, and local government in attendance. Small plaques were installed at the base of each tree, identifying them as protected specimens with historical and ecological significance. Sarah Chen gave another presentation about the trees' importance, this time focusing on their role as seed trees for oak regeneration throughout the region. The genetic diversity they represented was apparently crucial for maintaining healthy oak populations in the face of climate change and development pressure. But the most gratifying moment came when the county environmental officer explained the practical implications of the protected status. Not only were the trees themselves protected from removal or significant alteration, but the buffer zone around them meant that any activities on adjacent properties that might impact their health required environmental review and approval. Margaret was conspicuously absent from the ceremony, though I noticed her watching from her kitchen window. The Henderson, Clarkson, and Brewster families also stayed away, apparently unwilling to publicly acknowledge the trees they had tried to eliminate. The aftermath of the tree protection campaign transformed my relationship with the neighborhood in ways I hadn't expected. I received dozens of emails and phone calls from homeowners expressing support for protecting the trees and frustration with Margaret's heavy-handed approach to HOA management. Several neighbors apologized for not speaking up earlier when they had disagreed with various HOA policies. More importantly, the controversy had exposed broader issues with how the HOA was being managed. Margaret's unwillingness to consider alternatives or consult with experts had created unnecessary conflict and legal complications. Her assumption that HOA authority superseded all other considerations had proven to be both legally incorrect and politically damaging. The next HOA board election saw significant changes in leadership. Margaret chose not to run for re-election, citing her desire to focus on other priorities. Jake Morrison ran for a board position on a platform of collaborative decision-making and historic preservation, and he won easily. The new board adopted policies requiring environmental and historical impact assessments for any actions affecting mature trees or other potentially significant natural features. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Margaret's attempt to force me to remove the trees had resulted in their permanent protection and legal recognition of their historical significance. The neighbors who had complained about blocked views now had to apply for environmental permits if they wanted to trim branches that extended over property lines. The HOA that had demanded absolute authority over landscaping decisions now had to coordinate with county environmental officials for any activities that might impact the protected trees. But perhaps the most satisfying development was the broader attention the story had attracted to the issue of old-growth tree preservation. Sarah Chen used my trees as a case study in her presentations about the importance of protecting remaining old-growth specimens, and the media coverage had sparked interest in similar preservation efforts throughout the region. Environmental groups contacted me about other potential heritage trees that might be threatened by development or HOA policies. The precedent established by protecting my oaks had created a template for similar preservation efforts, and I found myself informally advising other homeowners who were facing pressure to remove mature trees. The legal protections also had practical benefits I hadn't anticipated. The County Environmental Office provided free consultation services for maintaining the health of protected trees, including professional arborist assessments and recommendations for optimal care. The Historical Society offered to include the trees in their regional heritage tour, which meant potential tax benefits for maintaining historically significant properties. But the most meaningful outcome was the change in how I experienced my daily life under the oaks. Knowing that they were officially recognized as historically and ecologically significant transformed my relationship with them. They weren't just beautiful features of my landscape anymore. They were living monuments to the natural heritage of the region, and I was their designated guardian. I started spending more time learning about oak ecology and forest history, reading about the Native American tribes who had lived among these trees centuries ago, and understanding the complex relationships between old-growth trees and the ecosystems they supported. The trees became a lens through which I could explore the deep history of the land I lived on. 6 months after the protection designation, I was contacted by a documentary filmmaker who was working on a project about suburban development and environmental preservation. She wanted to feature my trees as an example of successful grassroots conservation efforts, and she spent several days filming interviews and capturing footage of the oaks in different seasons and lighting conditions. The documentary wasn't scheduled for release for another year, but the filmmaker shared some of the raw footage with me, and I was amazed by how magnificent the trees looked on camera. The cinematographer had captured details I'd never noticed: the intricate patterns of bark texture, the complex architecture of the branch structure, the way light filtered through the leaves at different times of day. But the most powerful moment in the footage was a time-lapse sequence showing the trees through a complete annual cycle, from spring budding through summer fullness to autumn color change and winter dormancy. Watching that sequence, I was struck by the sense of continuity and permanence the trees represented. They had been cycling through seasons for over a century, and if properly protected, they would continue that cycle for perhaps another century or more. The first anniversary of the protection designation coincided with the annual neighborhood barbecue, which was held in the community center. I decided to host a smaller gathering in my backyard, under the protected oaks, as a way of celebrating their official recognition and thanking the people who had supported the preservation effort. Jake and Sarah came, along with representatives from the environmental groups that had supported the campaign. Several neighbors attended, including Mrs. Patterson and other homeowners who had spoken up during the contentious HOA meeting. Even some of the people who had initially supported Margaret's position came by, apparently having developed a new appreciation for the tree's significance. The gathering was informal, with people bringing dishes to share and spending the afternoon talking about the preservation campaign, the changes in neighborhood dynamics, and the broader implications for environmental protection in suburban communities. Children played under the trees, and I realized they were growing up with a different relationship to these ancient oaks than previous generations had experienced. As the sun set through the oak canopy, casting those familiar patterns of light and shadow across the lawn, I reflected on how much had changed since Margaret had first appeared at my door with her violation notice. The trees that she had dismissed as obstacles to property values were now legally recognized as irreplaceable natural heritage. The HOA authority that had seemed absolute was now constrained by environmental regulations and public oversight. But the most important change was in how the community understood its relationship to the natural world. The controversy had forced people to think about the value of things that couldn't be quantified in dollars or measured in property values. It had created conversations about history, ecology, and the responsibility of current generations to preserve irreplaceable resources for the future. Margaret eventually moved away from Willowbrook Estates, selling her house to a young family who expressed delight at living near the famous protected oaks. The new homeowners introduced themselves by bringing me a bottle of wine and asking about the tree's history and significance. They had researched the preservation story before buying the house, and they saw the protected trees as an asset rather than an obstacle. The Henderson, Clarkson, and Brewster families gradually adapted to their partially obstructed lake views, and some of them even came to appreciate the way the oak branches framed the water vista. The Clarksons installed a small gazebo in their backyard that was positioned to take advantage of the filtered views through the oak canopy, creating a more intimate and private lake viewing experience. 2 years after the protection designation, I received a call from the county environmental office informing me that my oak trees had been selected for inclusion in the state's official registry of historic trees. This was a higher level of recognition that provided additional legal protections and qualified the property for special conservation easements that could provide significant tax benefits. The registry ceremony was held at the state capitol, with the governor presenting certificates to property owners whose trees had been selected for inclusion. I stood in the ornate state reception room, holding a certificate that officially recognized my oak trees as historic landmarks worthy of preservation for future generations. But the real validation came from the dozens of letters I received from people who had heard about the preservation story and were inspired to protect significant trees on their own properties. Environmental groups reported increased interest in heritage tree programs, and several communities had adopted policies requiring environmental impact assessments before approving the removal of mature trees. The precedent established by protecting my oaks had created a ripple effect that extended far beyond my neighborhood. Other HOAs were now consulting with environmental experts before making decisions about tree removal, and some had adopted policies specifically designed to protect mature specimens that might have historical or ecological significance. Looking back on the entire experience, I realized that Margaret's demand for tree removal had inadvertently created something much more valuable than unobstructed lake views. It had sparked a community conversation about the balance between development pressure and environmental preservation, about the importance of protecting irreplaceable natural heritage, and about the responsibility of current generations to maintain the ecological and historical legacy they inherited. The oak trees continued their ancient cycle of seasons, their roots growing deeper into the soil that had supported them for over a century, their branches reaching higher toward the sky that had sheltered them through wars and peace, prosperity and depression, change and continuity. They stood as living monuments to the possibility of coexistence between human development and natural preservation. Proof that sometimes the most important victories are won not by compromise, but by recognizing the irreplaceable value of what we might otherwise take for granted. Standing under their canopy on quiet mornings, listening to the wind move through leaves that had been growing for longer than anyone could remember, I was reminded that some things are worth fighting for, and that the most meaningful battles are often fought not for personal gain, but for the preservation of something larger than ourselves. Something that connects us to the deep history of the land we temporarily inhabit, and will eventually leave to future generations who will need the same sense of rootedness and continuity that these ancient trees provided. The final irony was that Margaret's attempt to eliminate what she saw as obstacles to progress had instead created permanent monuments to the importance of preserving the irreplaceable. The trees that were supposed to be removed for the sake of property values had become legally protected assets that enhanced the value and character of the entire neighborhood. The HOA authority that was supposed to ensure community compliance had been replaced by environmental regulations that prioritized ecological preservation over aesthetic conformity. And in the end, the weekly fines that had been threatened as punishment for non-compliance had been replaced by tax benefits and conservation easements that rewarded the preservation of historically significant natural heritage. The community that had been divided by controversy had been united by a shared recognition of the importance of protecting irreplaceable resources for future generations. The oak trees stood unchanged through all of this human drama, their deep roots anchoring them to the earth, their spreading branches reaching toward the sky, their ancient wisdom reminding everyone who paused to notice that some things are worth preserving not because they serve our immediate purposes, but because they connect us to something larger and more enduring than our temporary concerns and conflicts. 5 years had passed since the protection designation when I received an unexpected phone call that would add another chapter to the oak tree story. The caller identified himself as Dr. Marcus Webb, a climate researcher from the National Environmental Research Institute, and he wanted to discuss a rather unusual proposition. Mr. Thompson, I've been following the story of your protected oak trees through Dr. Chen's publications, Dr. Webb explained. We're launching a new research program on climate adaptation in old-growth trees, and your specimens represent exactly the kind of long-term data source we need. I set down my coffee cup, intrigued by where this conversation might lead. What kind of research are you talking about? We're studying how century-old trees adapt to changing environmental conditions, Dr. Webb continued. Your oaks have been growing here through multiple climate cycles, and their growth rings contain a record of environmental changes that could help us understand how forests might respond to future climate challenges. The proposal was fascinating. Dr. Webb's team wanted to establish a permanent research station on my property, using non-invasive monitoring equipment to track the tree's responses to weather patterns, soil conditions, and atmospheric and mole changes. The data would contribute to a nationwide database of climate adaptation research, and my trees would become part of the scientific record documenting how old-growth forests respond to environmental stress. There would be benefits for you as well, Dr. Webb added. The research station would qualify your property for additional conservation tax credits, and we'd provide ongoing professional maintenance for the trees at no cost to you. The timing couldn't have been better. I'd been thinking about the long-term care of the trees as I approached retirement, wondering how to ensure their continued health and protection. Having a team of professional researchers monitoring their condition would provide the best possible care while contributing to important scientific knowledge. The installation of the research equipment took place over several weeks, with technicians carefully positioning sensors and monitoring devices throughout the root zone and canopy. The equipment was designed to be as unobtrusive as possible, with most of the monitoring apparatus hidden among the branches or buried in the soil around the trees. Dr. Webb's team also installed a small weather station and soil analysis system that would provide continuous data about the environmental conditions affecting the trees. The information would be transmitted wirelessly to the Research Institute, where computer models would analyze patterns and changes in the tree's vital signs. The research station attracted attention from other scientists and environmental organizations. Within 6 months, my backyard had become an informal field laboratory where graduate students and researchers came to study various aspects of old-growth tree ecology. I found myself learning more about the trees than I'd ever imagined possible. One of the most surprising discoveries came from Dr. Lisa Park, a soil biologist who was studying the mycorrhizal networks around the oak roots. Her research revealed that my trees were connected to a vast underground fungal network that extended throughout the neighborhood, linking them to other mature trees and creating a complex communication system that allowed them to share resources and information. Your oaks are actually the hub of a much larger ecosystem, Dr. Park explained during one of her visits. They're supporting dozens of other trees and plants through this underground network, and they're receiving support in return. It's like a natural internet that's been operating here for decades. This discovery added another layer to the tree's protected status. The underground network they anchored was now recognized as an ecologically significant system that extended far beyond my property boundaries. Any major landscaping or construction projects in the neighborhood would need to consider the potential impact on this underground ecosystem. The research findings were published in several scientific journals, and my trees became increasingly famous in environmental circles. I started receiving visitors from around the world, researchers and conservationists who wanted to see firsthand how old-growth trees could be protected and studied in suburban environments. One visitor who made a particular impression was Dr. Eleanor Rodriguez, a forest ecologist from Costa Rica who was studying urban forest conservation. She spent a week documenting the integration of the research station into the neighborhood environment, interviewing neighbors about their experiences living near protected trees. "What you've accomplished here is remarkable," Dr. Rodriguez told me as she prepared to leave. "You've created a model for how communities can protect natural heritage while supporting scientific research. This could be replicated in cities around the world." Her comment sparked an idea that had been forming in my mind. What if the success of protecting my oak trees could be scaled up to create a network of protected urban forests? What if other neighborhoods could learn from our experience and establish their own heritage tree programs? I started reaching out to environmental organizations and urban planning departments, sharing the story of how we'd protected the oaks and the benefits that had resulted. The response was enthusiastic, with several cities expressing interest in developing similar programs. The first replication effort took place in Portland, Oregon, where a neighborhood association was facing pressure to remove mature Douglas's fir trees that blocked views of Mount Hood. Using the template we developed, the residents worked with local universities and environmental groups to document the tree's ecological significance and secure protected status. The Portland project was successful, and it led to inquiries from communities across the country. I found myself traveling to various cities as a consultant, helping other neighborhoods navigate the process of protecting significant trees from development pressure or HOA demands. Each project taught me something new about the complex relationships between urban development, environmental protection, and community organizing. The legal and scientific framework we developed for protecting my oaks was adaptable to different situations, but each community faced unique challenges and opportunities. In Seattle, we helped protect a grove of old-growth cedars that were threatened by a shopping mall expansion. In Austin, we secured heritage designation for a massive live oak that had been growing in a downtown park for over 2 centuries. In Boston, we worked with a neighborhood association to protect elm trees that had survived the Dutch elm disease epidemic. The network of protected urban forests grew steadily, and I realized that Margaret's attempt to force me to remove my trees had inadvertently sparked a national movement. Communities across the country were recognizing the value of protecting mature trees and the ecosystems they supported. The 10th anniversary of my oak trees protection designation coincided with the publication of a comprehensive research study based on data collected at the research station. The findings were groundbreaking, showing how old-growth trees in urban environments could adapt to climate change and continue providing ecosystem services despite challenging conditions. The study also documented the economic benefits of protecting mature trees, including energy savings from natural cooling, stormwater management, air pollution reduction, and property value enhancement. The research proved that the costs of protecting old-growth trees were far outweighed by the benefits they provided to communities. But perhaps the most significant finding was the demonstration that protected trees could serve as seed sources for forest regeneration. My oaks had produced thousands of acorns over the years, and many of them had sprouted into saplings that were now growing throughout the neighborhood. The genetic diversity preserved in the old-growth trees was being passed on to new generations of oaks. The anniversary celebration was held in my backyard, with representatives from all the communities that had replicated our tree protection model. Dr. Webb presented the research findings, and city officials from various municipalities spoke about the urban forest programs they had established. Jake Morrison, who had become a prominent advocate for urban forest conservation, gave a keynote address about the importance of protecting natural heritage in developed landscapes. His presentation traced the evolution from my single property dispute to a nationwide movement that had protected thousands of trees and inspired new approaches to urban planning. What started as one man's refusal to cut down 2 trees has become a model for how communities can balance development with environmental protection, Jake said. These trees have taught us that preservation and progress don't have to be in conflict. The celebration continued into the evening, with people sharing stories about their own tree protection efforts and discussing future projects. Children played under the oak canopy, and I realized that some of them had never known a world where these trees weren't protected landmarks. As the guests departed and the evening grew quiet, I found myself alone under the oaks, reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The trees that Margaret had dismissed as obstacles to property values had become the foundation for a movement that was transforming how communities thought about urban forests. The research station continued to generate valuable data, and the undergraduate students who worked there often told me that their experience with the oak trees had inspired them to pursue careers in environmental science. The trees had become teaching tools, helping train the next generation of forest ecologists and conservation biologists. But the most meaningful aspect of the entire experience was the sense of continuity and purpose it had created. The trees that had been growing here for over a century would continue growing for perhaps another century, and the protection framework we'd established would ensure their survival for future generations. The legal precedent we'd set had been strengthened by subsequent court cases, creating a robust foundation for protecting significant trees from development pressure. The scientific research had demonstrated the ecological value of old-growth urban forests, providing evidence that policymakers could use to justify conservation investments. And the community engagement that had started with opposition to Margaret's tree removal demand had evolved into a sophisticated network of environmental advocates who understood how to work within legal and political systems to achieve conservation goals. Standing under the oak canopy on quiet evenings, watching the sunset filter through leaves that had been growing for longer than anyone could remember, I was reminded that the most important victories are often won not through dramatic confrontation, but through patient persistence and the gradual accumulation of support from people who share common values. The trees had taught me that preservation requires both scientific understanding and political engagement, both legal protection and community support. They had shown me that individual actions could have far-reaching consequences, and that standing up for what you believe in can inspire others to do the same. Margaret's attempt to eliminate what she saw as obstacles to progress had instead created permanent monuments to the possibility of coexistence between human development and natural preservation. The trees that were supposed to be removed for the sake of conformity had become symbols of the importance of protecting diversity and irreplaceable heritage. And in the end, the weekly fines that had been threatened as punishment for noncompliance had been replaced by research grants and conservation funding that supported scientific understanding and environmental protection. The community that had been divided by controversy had been united by a shared commitment to preserving irreplaceable resources for future generations. The oak trees remained anchored in the soil that had supported them for over a century, their branches reaching toward the sky that had sheltered them through all the changes and challenges of human history. They stood as living proof that some things are worth fighting for, and that the most meaningful battles are often fought not for personal gain, but for the preservation of something larger than ourselves.